The text we're going to engage with this morning for our message is the Old Testament lesson from Jeremiah chapter 28 and the gospel lesson where Jesus speaks to us in John chapter 10 with particular focus on verses 34 to 39. And verse 34 is where Jesus said he did not come to bring peace but a sword. And we're going to reflect on what that means. Will you join me in a word of prayer? Well, Lord, open thou our hearts to hear. Through thy word to us draw near. Let us thy word heir pure retain. Let us thy children and heirs remain. Amen. I'd like to start off this morning to invite you to imagine a peaceful scene. So take a few minutes. We have some time. Just relax. Close your eyes if you want to and imagine that peaceful scene. On second thought, maybe you're too sleepy. Don't close your eyes if that's too tempting. But if you can, remain awake and close your eyes or whatever you need to do to go to that peaceful scene and just imagine. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. It's going to seem like a long time, but don't count the seconds. I'll be counting them, and I'll make sure to let you know when we're done. So for just 30 seconds, imagine that peaceful scene. Okay. Did you have a peaceful scene in your mind? Were you in some kind of a natural landscape? Were you at the beach? Were you watching a sunset or a dawn? Was there a beautiful mountain backdrop to your peaceful scene? And really the question I want to ask you this morning, this one I'm going to ask for a show of hands for. How many of you in your peaceful scene had other people in your peaceful scene? If there were other people in your scene, raise your hand. Okay. If your peaceful scene had no other people in it, raise your hand. Wow. This morning was the first time I've ever asked that question to an audience, and I was told to expect this, but I was a little skeptical. I wasn't sure, and sure enough, in both services so far, that's how it's turned out. The majority of you had no other people in your peaceful scene. So why is that? I mean, and it was better than 2/3 in this service. Maybe a third of you, if that many, maybe a quarter of you had people in your peaceful scenes. But 2/3 to 3/4 of you didn't have anybody else. You were alone in your peaceful scene. And that's what I was told to expect. It was true in the first service. It was true in this service. So why is that? That when we imagine peace, the first thing we do is get rid of all the people. Zechariah said in Zechariah chapter 9, verses 9 to 10, and actually this is the Old Testament lesson that's coming for next week. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. For see, your king comes to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, riding on a donkey, humble on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And he proclaims peace to the nations. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem. He will cut off the battle bow, and his reign will be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. It's Zechariah 9, verses 9 to 10. The words of that prophecy of Zechariah is what inspired the song that started as a poem, America the Beautiful. You know that line in it, from sea to shining sea. America is from sea to shining sea, but also it comes from the lines of that prophecy in Jeremiah. It was a poem that was written around the turn of the 20th century for a 4th of July week like this, and it was written for a church periodical. And after its publication, a church organist put it to music, and it became the song that we know of as America the Beautiful, for God shed his grace on thee. And when we think of that song, most often, which verse do you know the best? Most often the verse that we think of is the first verse, which is all of the beautiful natural landscapes, right? It's the one that talks about purple mountain majesties and the fruited plains and the beautiful for spacious skies. when we think about it, we think about that lasting peace in terms of all those beautiful landscapes. But actually in that song, if you were to continue to listen to it throughout the rest of it, people come in the latter verses. So in the later verses, it's more about people. And when people are brought into it, the mention is of the impassioned stress of the pilgrims. Or there's mention of the liberating strife of the heroes. Or of the pilgrims, or of the patriots' dreams that are undimmed by human tears. You see, in those latter verses that talk about people comes the recognition that this peace that we're singing about does not come peacefully. So the author of that song, that poem, that hymn, was reflecting on these verses of Zechariah and was imagining that the peace that the Messianic hopes would bring would be the peace that we would recognize here in America as we turn to the Lord and as we trust in Him. But those Messianic hopes were hoped for long before that song was written. This is what people in the New Testament hope for too. In fact, those words of Zechariah chapter 9, verses 9 to 10, they had a fulfillment in the Scriptures, where it says that Jerusalem would rejoice, and Zion would rejoice, because the King is coming, having salvation, riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. That took place on the day that we typically call Palm Sunday in the Gospels, when Jesus rode into Jerusalem, and all Jerusalem was rejoicing, and it echoed all throughout Jerusalem, showing that the people had the same hopes. They had hopes that as Jesus came, He would be the bringer of a lasting peace. That was the Messianic hope. And even though that wasn't going to take place in Matthew's Gospel until later in Jesus' ministry in chapter 21, already in chapter 10, where our Gospel comes from, the people were already having those hopes about Jesus. To the extent that they recognized Him as the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One, the Promised One of God, the King who was bringing salvation, they attached to Him that Messianic hope that He would be the one to bring a lasting peace. And so the words of our Gospel lesson are very startling. When in chapter 10, verse 34, the beginning of our Gospel lesson, the bringer of that peace, the Prince of Peace, said, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth, for I have not come to bring peace, but the sword." What does Jesus mean by that? What does it mean when the bringer of peace says He comes not to bring peace, but to bring a sword? Well, when the bringer of peace says that He's coming not to bring peace, it means things are becoming serious. This words of Jesus, Matthew chapter 10, verse 34 and following, that we're focusing on today, come out of a larger section that's been a running gospel lesson for us for the last several weeks. It started back in Matthew chapter 9, where Jesus was saying He was going to send out laborers into His harvest field, and He told His disciples to pray for laborers for the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And then after that, Jesus sent out in chapter 10 His disciples to be the first of those laborers in the harvest. And then in the intervening verses in chapter 10, between that and where we are now, Jesus gave the disciples all sorts of instructions on how to carry out that mission. He told them not to take any gold or silver or copper in their money bags, and not to take a knapsack, and don't take 2 tunics or 2 pairs of sandals. Just carry with you nothing but the Word of God. But by later in Jesus' ministry, Luke chapter 22, at the end of the chapter, the game has changed. And Jesus said to His disciples, "Do you remember when I sent you out? And I told you to take no money in your money bags, and do not take a knapsack, and don't take a spare tunic or extra sandals?" And they said, "Yes." And He said, "Did you lack anything?" And they said, "No, nothing." And He said, "But now I say to you, let the one who has a money bag take it, and let anyone who has a knapsack take it. And if anyone does not have a sword, let him sell his cloak and buy one. For the scriptures of the prophets must be fulfilled in me, that you would be numbered among the transgressors." When Jesus said that to the disciples, He did not mean that the disciples were to go out and begin making war for the kingdom of God. But they began to interpret it that way. They thought that might be what He meant, because He said, if you don't have a sword, then sell your tunic and buy one. And so right away after that, in Luke chapter 22, the disciples started to scour around the house to see if they could find some swords. And they came up with a couple of them. And they said, "Jesus, we have 2. disciples having swords laying around. Why would a disciple just have a sword laying around? I don't know, maybe this was the first century equivalent of people today who have a gun at their house for protection somewhere. 2 out of every 12 disciples had a sword in their house for protection. But now it wouldn't just be stuffed in a cabinet somewhere. They were actually going to have it on their person. And they took it with them into the garden when they were praying with Jesus that night. And that wasn't necessarily a good thing, because when everything went sideways in the garden, one of those sword-wielding disciples decided to draw down on their aggressors and cut off the ear of somebody else. Now, if you're cutting off the ear of somebody in full swing with a sword, you're not actually aiming for their ear. That was a kill shot, and it's just fortunate that the disciple missed. Because Jesus went over and took that person's ear and then began to remind this disciple that wasn't what they were there for. And in his last act of healing in the scriptures before his crucifixion, he took that ear and he mended it, put it back on the person that came off of, and then he said to that disciple who swung the sword, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will die by the sword. For don't you think that I could call on my Father in heaven? He would at once send 12 legions of angels to help me. But then how would the scriptures be fulfilled that say that these things must take place?" No, when Jesus said to them, "If you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one," he was not saying that now we're going to spread the kingdom of God by violence. He wasn't even saying we're going to defend the kingdom of God by violence, even though the disciples misunderstood him that way, and many Christians since have misunderstood Jesus that way. Think of the Crusades, trying to take back the Holy Land by the sword. Or think of the time of the Inquisition or in the Reformation, where Christians tried to stamp out heresy in the church with the punishment of death. That's not what Jesus was calling us to do. But we do see what Jesus was saying in our text today reflected in those things. When Jesus said, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace, for I have not come to bring peace but a sword," he meant that his presence and his message would bring out the worst in people. His presence and his message would bring out the worst in people. And it was already doing so among the disciples there in the garden. And it's reflected in those who came to arrest Jesus in the garden too. For shortly thereafter, Jesus was arrested. And when he was arrested, he said to those arresting him, "You come after me with clubs and swords and spears, like I am a robber. Was I not with you in the temple, teaching alongside of you every day, and yet you did not seize me?" But this has happened so that the scriptures and the prophets might be fulfilled. What scriptures of the prophets are those? Well, prophets like the prophet in our Old Testament lesson, the prophet Jeremiah, who had said there would be no peace coming. Even though other prophets of Jeremiah's time were saying, "Peace, peace, everything is good, peace," Jeremiah said there is no. In fact, let's look at it. Go back to your Old Testament lesson. You'll find that on page 5. And look at verse 8. Jeremiah reminds the people, "The prophets who preceded you and me from ancient times prophesied war and famine and pestilence amidst many countries and great kingdoms. And as for that prophet, like Hananiah, who prophesies peace, when the word of that prophet comes to pass, then it will be known that the Lord has truly sent the prophet." In other words, Jeremiah is saying, do you think your word, Hananiah, is better than the words of the prophets of the ancient times, like Isaiah, who lived around 100 years before Jeremiah? What about his word that prophesied that the Messiah would be numbered among the transgressors, that he would be rejected, that he would be led like a sheep to the slaughter? Which word is going to come true, the word about peace or the words of the prophet Isaiah and those who preceded him? Would it be Jeremiah's words? Or would Hananiah be shown just to be a religious windbag, preaching what the people wanted to hear? Well, shortly thereafter, Jesus was arrested in the garden. He was numbered among the transgressors. He was murdered. And I say murdered because he wasn't executed. He wasn't found guilty in a trial. Instead, he was put before trial and run through trumped-up charges and false witnesses that were brought against him. And that's why he was killed. He was numbered among the transgressors, as Isaiah had said in Isaiah 53, and Jesus said would be fulfilled, but he wasn't one of them. It's as Proverbs 25, verse 18 says, "Like a war club, or a sword, or a sharp arrow, is the false testimony that one gives against his neighbor." See, sometimes the swords are figurative. The swords and the clubs and the sharp arrows are the false testimonies that one has against their neighbor. And sinful people have always been doing that throughout time. And Jesus said, "I did not come to bring peace but a sword," because he brings out that worst in some people. And we even see that in ourselves. It happens among us because oftentimes our perception of things that we dislike becomes a distorted and trumped up perception. We build this sort of facade of falsehoods around it that just stir us up into a frenzy of dislike about other people around us. And just in the way that we look at a situation. And when we do that, when we're looking through this false facade and not recognizing it, it might seem like truth to us, but it's not really a truth. It's a fabricated truth in our mind that causes us to become even angrier and disappointed in what we see. And then that eventually leads to us bearing false witness about other people around us, either in our gossip or the way we degrade their character and talking about them to other people. We're just as apt to use those sharp swords because people have been doing that. They've been doing that for centuries, ever since the dawn of time, using these clubs and these sharp swords and these arrows. I mean, think back in the scriptures to the very first people in the dawn of time. Think back to Cain and Abel. You know that story? If you don't, you could go and read it. It's in Genesis chapter 4. I encourage you to look at it. But do you know the story of Otzi? Maybe not. That one's not in the Bible. Otzi is the oldest and best preserved human in archaeological history. So he's only about 45 years old when he died, at least the archaeologists tell us. But he lived 5,300 years ago. And Otzi is the best preserved ancient human ever found in archaeological history, better preserved even than the mummies, because Otzi was found in the Italian Alps, and we don't really know his name. He's just named after the area of the Alps where he was found, as the Oldstall Mountains in the Alps. And some tourists were going through there in 1991, and they found this man in the melted ice because the glacier was receding. But he had been there frozen in ice for 5,000 plus years. And he was the best preserved of any human ever found in archaeological history. So well preserved that even his skin was still on his body, and there was even food still in his stomach. And so researchers could study and figure out what kind of food that he had been eating. And he even had clothes on his body. They could see what kind of clothes they wore 5,300 years ago. And a lot of his tools and implements were laying around him. And so since 1991, they've been studying the different kind of tools that they found in his camp and what he used. We learned a lot about ancient people from studying Otzi. But just this spring, researchers did a new study that they hadn't done yet, and that was to try to determine how Otzi died. And so they brought in some criminal investigators who were used to determining criminal cases, and especially cold cases, but they'd never dealt with one this cold. And so they wanted to determine what was it that killed Otzi. And as they did that this spring, some new information came out and was published. They had found he had a deep gash in one of his hands between his thumb and his forefinger, which they said was indicative of somebody who was defending himself. It was a defensive wound. So he's holding up his hand and stopping the blade of an aggressor. But that had been there for a while, but not long enough to heal. So that didn't happen the day that he died. But it was a CT scan that was the definitive evidence that pointed to murder. Because they did a CT scan of Otzi, and they found a sharp arrowhead that was buried in him below his left shoulder, cutting off his subclavicle artery, a wound that would be fatal, they say, even to people with our modern day technology. And they didn't notice this at first because apparently Otzi had pulled the arrow shaft out before he died, and so it was never noticed that he had this arrowhead buried deep within him until they did that CT scan and revealed that Otzi had been murdered. Although the detectives said they'll probably never know the mystery, never solve who killed Otzi. But they do know how he died. What about the mystery of the Prince of Peace bringing a sword? Well, we know who murdered him. That's not a mystery to us. But the mystery is why the Prince of Peace would bring a sword. It's because these same hostilities, the same hostilities that killed Abel, that killed Otzi, the same hostilities that are apparent in our false witness against other people, that's like a figurative sword or a sharp arrowhead that burrows deep within them, those same hostilities will be escalating around Jesus. See, that's what the scriptures are telling us today. Jesus said, I came not to bring peace, but a sword. And he's telling us that the hostilities that are there in sinful people will continue to escalate on account of Jesus. But true peace will be found in Jesus. I want to repeat that for you. The hostilities are there and sinful people will escalate on account of Jesus, but true peace will be found in Jesus. See, this is why Jesus said in our gospel lesson, if we keep reading it, chapter 10, verse 35, he said, I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. And a person's enemies will be those in his own family. Jesus said, whoever loves his father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. But whoever loves his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Matthew chapter 10, verses 35 through 39. What Jesus is saying there, these hostilities that will escalate on account of him, will not only be escalating in the world between different groups of people, but they will escalate even within people's own families. And we need to be willing to face that the way Jesus faced it. Jesus, who is the Prince of Peace. And so he's not calling us to face that with swords or with animosity towards our family members or towards others around us, not even towards those who disdain us in faith, but to walk the way Jesus walked, to take up our cross. What's the cross? The cross is the sword of hostility that we'll still see going on around us, even though Jesus, the Prince of Peace, has come. Be ready to face that cross, to carry that cross. How? Humbly, like Jesus came humbly, riding on a colt full of a donkey. We're ready to take that and to be hurt by it, just like Jesus was hurt by it, and crushed by it, and killed by it for the sake of the Lord. And in the Lord, we will find peace. Jesus talks about this too. And in Ephesians chapter 2, it says that Jesus is the one who takes people who are hostile towards one another and first gives them peace with God so they're no longer hostile with Jesus, and then brings the two together in one body. So in him, we find peace. In fact, Ephesians 2:14 says, he himself is our peace. He himself is our peace. And so if we want to find peace, true peace on a day like this, well, it's not about looking in the news. And it's not about looking at our families. It's about burrowing in closer to Jesus. And if we want to see if what the prophet said is true, like Jeremiah tells us to do, then we burrow in closer to Jesus and look for our peace there. And then we'll find out if what the prophet said is true. In the name of Jesus, our Savior. Amen.